This is Voicemail, the Universal Postal Union's podcast covering the wonderful world of mail. I'm your host, Ian Kerr. In this episode, I speak with Siva Somasundram, Director of Policy, Regulation and Markets at the UPU, about preparations for the 28th Universal Postal Congress coming up soon in Dubai. Joining me on the line is Siva Somasundram. Siva is the Director of Policy, Regulation and Markets at the UPU. Siva, welcome to the UPU Voicemail podcast. Let's start with the question we ask all of our guests. What's your first memory of the post? And given that you've had quite a postal career, could you have imagined back then that you would one day be working at the beating heart of the organisation that helps shape the global postal system?
Hello, Ian, and thanks very much for having me on the programme. Look, in terms of what I recall has been the earliest memory of the post, it's really the stories my mother and grandmother told me about my grandfather. My grandfather, and not many people know this, was actually a postmaster of a mid-sized town in Peninsular Malaysia. And while I never got to meet him because he passed before I was born, stories about his commitment to the community, his hard work and discipline resonate through the family. And one story in particular about him waking up at 4 a.m. every morning to meet the mail train from Kuala Lumpur in order to make sure that the mail from the town was on the train and to take mail off the train in order to get it to his people just speaks volumes. And in fact, you know, I think many members of my family are early risers. I think that's it's something that's passed down in generations. The other thing, Ian, not a lot of people know, is that I actually didn't start my career in the post. A recent addition to the family, in fact. I started off as a WTO trade negotiator and subsequently as a corporate lawyer dealing with international trade law and mergers and acquisitions. I joined Australia Post, and that's led me from place to place and ultimately to the UPU. So looking back, I would have never thought I would have ended up in the postal sector, but I still remember the time when I told my mum, who was then 80 plus years old, that I was joining the post. She smiled at me and said, life has come full circle, as it were. There you go.
Now, for those listeners who may not be familiar with the idea, the UPU Congress is the organisation's highest decision-making body. It's held every 4 years and attended by member countries from around the world. This year marks the 28th edition and it will be taking place in Dubai. What does it take to coordinate such a large-scale multilateral event? And what are the strategic goals shaping its structure and agenda?
Thanks, Ian. You're absolutely correct in pointing out that the Congress is the apex decision-making body of the UPU. It brings together the plenipotentiaries of our 192 member countries. It is a big jamboree in terms of people coming together to talk business, to talk work, and so on. But ultimately, it's a negotiating forum. And the fact that it is a negotiating forum means that there are a couple of things that need to be in place in order to pull it together. And these things sort of straddle both the substance and the procedures at Congress. The first and foremost is really the substantive preparations for the Congress. And a lot of this is actually done in the 4 years leading up to a Congress through all of the documents, the proposals for change in terms of the treaties, which will have to be sort of worked on, approved by the bodies of the union in the lead up to Congress and presented to Congress for its consideration. That work shouldn't be underestimated. It takes a lot of time and effort on the part of representatives of the member states, as well as, of course, the International Bureau. A second thing that needs to be in place in order to ensure the success of any Congress is actually the leadership and the close cooperation between the host member country and the International Bureau. The host country plays a very critical role in both the logistics and the organization of the Congress, but also in terms of generally leading the debate, leading the discussions, and ensuring that we end up with outcomes that everyone is at least partially satisfied with. And then finally, another critical factor, I think, to bring a Congress together is the outreach that we conduct at multiple levels with member states. And I think we'll have an opportunity to talk a bit more about this a bit later on. But the point here is that without that outreach in terms of information sessions, discussions, webinars, and so on, it's near impossible to try and pull together a decision-making, negotiating forum that is informed of what needs to be done. In terms of the objective and focus, it varies from Congress to Congress, but ultimately there are three overarching strategies that most goals that most Congresses turn to. One is, of course, the rule and policy changes needed to ensure that the international postal network remains fit for purpose. The second is the strategy and the business plan for the next 4 years, because the way the UPU operates is on a 4-year cycle. So at every Congress, we do actually have to determine what are we going to do for the next 4 years and the business plan that would support that strategy. And finally, and quite importantly, it also gives us an opportunity to review and finesse our development cooperation and technical assistance facilities, because we're very much tied to the idea that we shouldn't be leaving anyone behind. And really the strength of the network is only as strong as its weakest link. And that focus on the weakest link is really important.
Given the scale and complexity of the event and everything you've just described and the wide range of topics on the agenda, how is the UPU making sure delegates are well informed and prepared to actively take part in the discussions and the decision making?
We have a very structured and focused approach to outreach, and this outreach is critical to inform decision making at Congress. And I see there being really three components to this. The first, and quite boringly, it's actually the documentation that supports discussions. And a lot of this, by way of proposals, documents, they need to be up and published within set deadlines. And just to give you the scale of what's going to happen at Congress, we have approximately 145 proposals for changes to the treaties, and we have well over 60 over documents and information notes supporting those discussions, as well as pointing to other issues that need to be addressed at Congress. So the scale of the documentation and the work that's gone behind it is really important, because and I'm hoping here that member states, and I'm sure they will, pay careful attention to the documents, because that's what's going to allow them to participate proactively. The second component to the outreach is actually the meetings that we typically have in the run-up to a Congress. So we have what we call a virtual roadshow just before Congress with all of the different regional groupings. And the idea here is to present member states in each of the regions with an overview of Congress, what is expected at Congress, its structure, the committees, the issues that will be discussed, and to address questions that they may have. And to also point them to the particular issues that will require some debate and further consideration. And on top of all of that, we conduct dedicated forums, both in the run-up to Congress and in the previous years, over the last 4 years. We've had dedicated forums on remuneration, on strategy, sustainable development, and so on and so forth. And all of these forums, in some way or other, are focused on topics that will be addressed at Congress. So you can see how the outreach is at different levels of engagement. But ultimately, it's really about making sure that people are fully informed before they get to Congress.
A part of that lead-up includes the UPU Global Leaders Summit, which will open the 28th Congress and highlight some of the key themes facing the postal sector today. So what role is the summit intended to play on the first day, and how might it help set the tone for the discussions that follow?
That's a very good question, Ian, because the UPU Global Leaders Summit is a flagship event of the Congress. And there is a reason why it's been held on the first day, because it's meant to allow and enable and facilitate the participation of leaders within the postal sector. And by that, I mean ministers, the CEOs of postal operators, chiefs of regulatory agencies, and of course, our private sector stakeholders as well, CEOs of those entities. because a lot of them do turn up for the opening day, and the idea is to allow them to then engage in an informal. Well, it's not really informal, but it's the setting is meant to be informal in terms of a debate, a free-flowing debate that will do two things: one, to take stock of where we are and what we've achieved, and then to undertake a visioning exercise, which is really about, so here we are, this is what we've achieved, these are the issues, these are the constraints, these are the challenges and opportunities, and where do we want to go from there? And again, it's a very important event because it will set the tone and the context within which many of the other decisions that we will take for the rest of the week will play out, and particularly in the context of the discussions on the strategy and business plan for the next cycle. Typically what happens is it's usually the case that, and this is a good thing, a lot of what we will decide on will tend to be addressed, will tend to reflect the discussions that will take place at the Global Leaders Summit. So it's a follow through in terms of the highest leaders committing and recognizing that the issues that we are addressing through the formal decision-making processes.
Let's talk about the integrated product plan. The integrated product plan for 2026-29 is a substantial item on the Congress agenda. So how does it help designated operators respond to changing market needs and support the modernisation of postal services in practical terms?
The integrated product plan, Ian, is actually one of three core pillars of work that will be presented to the Congress. And I'll talk a bit more about the other two a bit later on. But the integrated product plan, in essence, it lays the foundations for modernizing the postal product portfolio in a way that it's aligned with the needs of e-commerce customers and some of the trends that we're seeing in the marketplace. In a nutshell, what it tries to do is it's seeking to achieve a more flexible, menu-driven services portfolio. And the idea is to make our product portfolio a lot more customizable according to the needs of the end user. In a broad sense, is seeking to achieve is a harmonization and integration of the value-added services that will be attached to each of the services within the portfolio, with the ultimate aim of making sure that the customer experience is seamless and they're able to choose the services that they want from a menu of options. Because that's exactly how the e-commerce market is developing. People want to be able to choose when things are delivered, how quickly that they get, and the pricing that they would pay for a particular service. And the product plan will see the introduction of a number of innovations. For example, place of delivery options, new proof of delivery options, and there will also be a push towards delivery duty paid services for items containing goods. And all of this is part of what our customers are telling us are critical. Importantly, it will also provide for mandatory tracking for items that will contain goods. As you know, everyone these days, when they're buying things on the internet or through e-commerce transactions, they're wanting to know where their particular item is in the supply chain. And apart from the customer expectation, there's also a very strong expectation by authorities like customs to be able to know who's actually sending things, where it's going, and so on. So that tracking and doing it on a mandatory basis is actually quite critical. So a lot of these things are aimed at modernizing the portfolio, making sure it's value-added services that people want and can choose as they wish.
Many of us listening to this podcast will remember the days when tracking was an optional extra. Oh my goodness, how times have changed since then. Let's move on to remuneration. The Congress is expected to adopt the Integrated Remuneration Plan for 2026-29. How is this plan structured to guide the development of a future integrated remuneration system for 2031 to 2034?
So when you have a new approach to products, this also requires us to sort of adapt the pricing remuneration models that we would have in place in relation to that product portfolio. And quite importantly, the idea of the remuneration the integrated remuneration plan, as well as the integrated remuneration system, the arising system, is to support the goal of keeping the universal service that is enshrined and ensured through the UPU network affordable and sustainable. You've talked about the plan, you've also talked about the system, and I think it's quite important to draw out the differences. So let me first talk about what is in store under the system for the next 4 years, because the plan that was adopted back in the Abidjan Congress 4 years ago got us on a track in terms of activities and work actions, which have then resulted in the system that will apply for the next 4 years and which has been proposed to this Congress for adoption. In line with the changes proposed to postal products and to better reflect the actual costs of international mail handling, the integrated remuneration system, which has been proposed to this Congress, will seek to have items remunerated, it's such a difficult word, remunerated based on their content. So as opposed to just looking at the size of things, we're also looking at the content. So whether it's a document or whether it's a good, as well as its format, letters or parcels. The proposals include a phasing out of the previous current inward land rate system used for remunerating parcels. And we're moving towards a system that will see remuneration for parcels based on domestic tariffs applicable to the referenced domestic services. This will allow designated operators to self-declare rates where the destination designated operator charges the sending postal operator rates based on the domestic tariffs. The IRS also proposes competitive performance-based remuneration for tracking. And again, this is to enhance customer and operational visibility of all barcoded postal items. And quite importantly, at least in the case of parcels, and given the increased focus on parcels and packets as a result of e-commerce, there is a move to try and subject that remuneration for these items to quality of service. And the idea is that having remuneration, quality-linked remuneration in place, this will incentivize reliable and predictable delivery and make the postal network a more attractive delivery provider. As to how the integrated remuneration plan is structured to guide the development of the future system, that is to say, in relation to the years 2031 to 2034, like any other plan, it sets out a set of detailed activities aiming at achieving key milestones needed for the development of that future system. These activities include market reviews, data and evidence collection through surveys and studies, information on domestic tariff references and notifications, and the list is long. But all of this is intended to ensure that member countries are well informed to agree on the next set of tweaks needed for the system.
Several proposals on the agenda address region-specific needs such as disaster preparedness, digitalisation and financial inclusion. So how is the UPU organising these discussions to ensure that regional priorities are meaningfully reflected?
That's a very, very good question, Ian. So the discussions on these issues will take place primarily in two forums. The first is what we call Congress Committee 6, and this is a committee that is absolutely focused on development cooperation and the needs of the regions. And it does this through having a number of things on its agenda, including one critical policy document referred to as the Development Cooperation Policy for the next 4 years. This policy document, at a general level, it confirms 3 priority areas for the UPU's activities in the next 4 years, including technical assistance and development projects relating to disaster preparedness, digitalization, and financial inclusion. Now, these priority areas were identified through extensive consultations with member countries across the different regions in the lead up to Congress. The document, however, doesn't stop there. What it does do is set the baseline for the development of tailored regional development plans for each of the regions in a sort of a post-Congress process. And this will get into the actual details of the activities and the deliverables for each region and the resourcing that's required. Now, the second forum or place where these issues will be taken up is what we refer to as Congress Committee 3. Now, Committee 3 has the task, amongst other things, of considering and approving the strategy and business plan for the next cycle. Now, the business plan has a number of work proposals that address these specific topics, both at a global, but as well at a regional level. And by that, I mean, there are activities that will be undertaken at UPU headquarters in Bern, as well as activities that we would work with our restricted unions in the regions. Again, these domain work proposals set out the actual activities, deliverables, and the outcome KPIs. And I stress the word outcome KPIs, and I'll come back to this a bit later on because it's an important point, on projects related to digitalization, disaster preparedness, and of course, financial inclusion.
Now, this Congress also includes elections for the Director General, Deputy Director General, and members of both the Council of Administration and the Postal Operations Council. So how is this process structured to ensure fairness, transparency, and broad participation?
The elections for the Director General, Deputy Director General, and the two councils are governed by very clear rules and administrative processes. These help ensure that the elections are fair, transparent, and importantly entail broad participation. So let me talk about, in brief terms, what some of these rules and processes are. There are very clear deadlines for nominations. This is to allow member states to consider the candidates, both across the DG and Deputy Director General elections, as well as elections for the councils. The International Bureau is required to communicate to member countries information on candidates on a regular basis. This means that we have a number of documents published containing information relating to the elections, the processes, as well as the candidates. And these documents are updated regularly as nominations come through over time. As part of its outreach, and I spoke about this previously in terms of the outreach to member states in informing them of what to expect at Congress, we also provide them, again, with information on the election rules, the processes, and the candidates. The elections themselves will be held in person, physically, and at Congress, with physical ballots, ballot boxes, country representatives as tellers, and in the case of the elections of the Director General and Deputy Director General, representatives of the countries nominating these candidates. And all of these tellers and representatives will be in the counting room. So there is a lot of accountability in terms of the vote count and how we process the votes. All in all, a fair and transparent and process that aims to ensure the membership as a whole are fully informed and able to participate and exercise their rights.
Turning our attention back to the Congress itself, what are the key outcomes you hope the 28th Congress will set in motion for the next work cycle, especially as the UPU looks ahead to the 29th Congress in 2029?
Well, that's a tough question, Ian, but because there's a lot on the agenda, but let me try and talk to some of the key things, at least from my perspective, are important outcomes from this Congress, or expected important outcomes. At a fundamental level, the proposed Dubai strategy and the associated business plan for the UPU for the next cycle, it adopts what I refer to as a results-based methodology. The focus is now clearly on achieving intended outcomes and impacts, as opposed to an activity-based measure of success. This is very much in line with best practice when it comes to strategy setting, implementation, and monitoring. And I think if we get it right in terms of its implementation, we will see clear indications of how well the postal sector as a whole is doing. We also talked about previously the integrated product plan, the integrated remuneration plan. These are absolutely the core pillars of the international postal network. But there is a third pillar, which is the integrated quality of service plan. And here, with these three pillars, I see them as the legs of a stool, the UPU stool. And the outcomes and decisions of Congress relating to these three core pillars will help define the contours of postal services over the next 4 years. So some really important changes. Some of it could have been faster. As you mentioned, it's taken quite a while to get to mandatory tracking. But when you have 192 member countries with very different development levels, it's progress, and it's significant progress. Also on the table are proposals aimed at promoting the digital transformation and diversification of postal services to capitalize on what I think is a real unique strength of the physical network with an extensive reach. There are also proposals to ensure cyber resilience and the cyber protection of the postal network, and importantly, proposals to facilitate the sustainable transformation of the postal network. Now, all of these proposals deal, in my view, with next generation issues in some respects, And member countries, by approving these proposals, will at this Congress have the opportunity to ensure the future readiness of the network, as it were.
Beyond the proposals on the table, this Congress is also redefining how the UPU works, including potential changes to allow hybrid participation. What do you see as the lasting significance of the 28th Congress for both the organisation and for the wider postal sector?
Thanks, Ian. I've talked a bit about the results-based methodology that will underpin the strategy and business plan of the institution for the next 4 years, so I won't go over that. But I do have three things in mind when I'm thinking through about what could be the outcomes that will have a lasting significance. One of which you've already mentioned in terms of hybrid participation. So for those of us who have been involved in this process, you might recall during the pandemic and when there was total shutdowns across many of our member states, the only way we could hold the Congress in 2021 in Abidjan was to enable hybrid participation, which meant that there were delegates in the room as well as representatives of member states participating online. Now, there was and there has been for quite a while some hesitation around enabling hybrid participation on an ongoing basis, because there's still, at least amongst our member states, some concerns around decision-making, particularly when it entails critical votes on matters that require, or at least a level of security relating to the votes, that it be done in person. And so we adopted an approach where we amended the rules of procedure for Congress to enable a hybrid meeting just for the particular Congress itself. But the underlying rules still called for physical meetings. This meant that this was first done at the Abidjan Congress in 2021. As you may recall, we also had an extraordinary Congress in Riyadh in 2023. And so at the start of the Riyadh Congress, we adopted changes to the rules of procedure to enable a hybrid meeting, which was then time-bound to the Congress itself. It was limited to the duration of the Congress. And for this Congress, we'll do exactly the same thing, except that now on the table, we have proposals that will seek to make hybrid modalities a permanent feature of Congress. And this is, and it's a personal view, it's not necessarily shared by member states across the board. But I think what it does is it achieves greater inclusion. So if you look at the numbers of participants, both in person and online, we have nearly 3,000 over people joining a Congress. And while much of the debate actually happens in the room, people in capitals who are unable to travel, who are unable to join the delegation because of resource constraints, funding constraints, are now able to follow the proceedings. They are actually able to take the floor and say things. And this means that we bring a wealth of expertise, people back in capitals being able to engage. And I think this is if we have these proposals adopted, it'll be a very significant change. And can I also say that we're a 150-year-old institution, but notwithstanding that, we are actually one of the front runners amongst UN institutions when it comes to adopting hybrid modalities, including voting using electronic platforms. Online electronic platforms. The second thing, which is going to be quite important, is the ongoing work on what's referred to as opening up of the UPU to wider postal sector players. You might recall the Riyadh Extraordinary Congress took some very important decisions on that front, which has resulted in the creation of what we refer to as the ready-to-market interoperability group. The idea here is to enable designated operators, our governments, to work with private sector players on projects and initiatives that represent win-win outcomes for everyone. And there is an increasing recognition that the postal supply chain no longer is just post-to-post with carriers in between. It involves a whole range of other players. And customers are not concerned about who's delivering it, they're more concerned about the experience. And this means working in a seamless fashion across the supply chain, not just the postal supply chain, but potentially across the postal and commercial supply chains. And Post themselves are increasingly doing this. They're not only working in terms of postal items, but they're also delivering commercial items. And so the idea of the interoperability group is to create a forum where actual practical projects can be launched, allowing such partners to come together and drive change. And the final thing that I think it's a proposal that's on the table, but an important one. It seeks to expand the functions of the Consultative Committee. So for those listeners who don't know what the Consultative Committee is, it's a body of the UPU that provides the primary forum through which our designated operators, governments, and the union as a whole engages with the private sector. And so the Consultative Committee has traditionally played an advisory role. Members of the Consultative Committee are able to engage in debate in our bodies, provide inputs, and so on. But the proposed rule change will actually see the Consultative Committee being able to initiate and to supervise and monitor projects between designated operators and private sector players, as well as between private sector players themselves. So it's increasingly, again, coming back to this idea of interoperability and fostering it. So it's really all about making the postal sector future ready and the institution future ready as well.
Finally then, looking ahead, what is one guiding idea you believe should shape the transformation of the global postal sector in the coming years?
I must say that this is probably the toughest question I'm faced with, because there are a number of different things that I think we need to do to inform and shape our transformation. We are at a point where transformation is a must, and I think and there are a number of things that will be critical. But if I was pressed for one, it comes back to this point about interoperability, and the word that I've used in the past, and it's something that we've reflected in the 2023 Postal Sector report, State of the Postal Sector report of the UPU, the concept of hyper-collaboration. And what do I mean by this? In a world that's highly interconnected, where boundaries and borders are increasingly seamless, and with innovation gathering at pace, we need to work with a broader set of partners in the postal ecosystem. And I think it has to be an essential modus operandi. It's not just a nice to have. It's critical. And hyper collaboration is really about the depth, scale, and the multidimensionality of our collaborative efforts. You have a whole range of digital platforms, real-time communication tools, advanced data sharing mechanisms, which can pave the way for this hyper collaboration. These tools get rid of borders, and they allow us to, in many respects, collaborate between multiple parties and entities across the globe. And if it's facilitated by AI, we can actually rapidly innovate. We can deploy those innovations and tap into a much broader pool of data and knowledge and expertise. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for the creation of value across the entire value chain. And this could lead to the creation of new markets or sectors, and ultimately reduce costs, achieve efficiencies, and do all of the things that's required to make the postal sector sustainable and something that remains part of all our stories, not just us, but also our children.
Well, Siva, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing all of those insights into the workings of the UPU, the workings of the Congress, and some of your own visions for the future. Siva Somasundram, Director of Policy, Regulation and Markets at the UPU, thank you very much for joining us on the Voicemail podcast today.
Thanks very much, Ian. Thank you.
You've been listening to Voicemail, the official podcast of the Universal Postal Union. Subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcast platform and you'll get each episode downloaded to the device of your choosing as it's released. My thanks to the team at the UPU for their help putting together this episode. I'm your host, Ian Kerr, and I'll look forward to your company next time on Voicemail, the podcast of the UPU.